Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the panel session, Beyond Publish or Perish, Attracting Funding for Impact. My name is Clare Thibodeaux. I am the Director of Scientific Affairs at Cures Within Reach. And I just want to say it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first part of the 2021 Rare Drug Development Symposium. And thank you to Global Genes and the Orphan Disease Center for putting together such a fantastic program. We're excited to have you here today to talk about some of the challenges and opportunities for young investigators when it comes to research funding. We'll be joined by Sheldon Garrison from Advocate Aurora Health and Katja Brose from the Zuckerberg Initiative. But before we get started, I have a few housekeeping notes, which I will now read to you. First of all, you'll notice a number of boxes and sections to the right and left of the video attendee view, all of which can be minimized or emphasized. The chat allows you to interact with others and program staff, and we hope you use this opportunity to make some new connections. The question box, very important, is located on the left of the screen in the attendee view, below chat and polling. We encourage you to use the questions box to share your questions with presenters. This is your time to find answers and insights to help you advance your work as a partner in research. Please note that the speakers will not be able to see any questions in chat, so please use the question section and be sure to upvote the questions that you see there that you like. If we're not able to address all your questions, we'll do the best that we can to follow up afterwards. To the right of your video, you'll see captions and translations. To utilize either, please expand the session and select your language. Thank you to Horizon and Greenwich Biosciences for their support of these tools. Additionally, you're welcome to utilize the notes function in the player. Just take your notes in there and they will automatically be emailed to you when the session concludes. If you have any questions about the technology or the program, please look for the Request Support button in each session or the live support chat in the bottom right corner of all non-session pages. And finally, we encourage you all to participate as active listeners and take advantage of an opportunity to hear from leaders and experts here and ask questions of them. We want to ensure that we've created a relevant and impactful program for you, and we greatly appreciate you sharing your time with us. So I will let Sheldon and Katja introduce themselves as they do their presentations. And in the meantime, I will kick off our session with some background information about Cures Within Reach and our role in funding. So again, I am the Director of Scientific Affairs with Cures Within Reach, which is a nonprofit based in Chicago. We are focused specifically on repurposing research and have been for over a dozen years now. What we mean by repurposing research is using already approved therapies such as drugs, devices, nutraceuticals, diagnostics, and testing them to see if they're safe and effective in new disease areas. As I said, we've been doing this for over a dozen years. And as an organization, we are disease agnostic, we're geography agnostic, we are population agnostic, and we are indifferent to commercial value. What we do is we work with our supporters in a donor-directed impact philanthropy way to focus our funding in areas of interest, including rare diseases. I'm sure I don't need to tell everyone here today that repurposing has always been a big part of rare disease treatments. And for our current portfolio, even now, our 33 projects that we have ongoing, over 40% of those are in rare diseases. So Cures Within Reach provides funding at a really important and critical time in the funding life cycle. We like to call this the comeback when phase. So imagine there's a PI who has a really interesting research idea that's come from either animal work or drug screening. Perhaps there are some case studies in the literature or even a retrospective study. And now this PI wants to test this repurposing research idea in humans. They may go to the NIH or the DoD or some other funding organization with their idea, and then they may hear these words: come back when? Come back when you have the dosing data. Come back when you have some safety information. Come back when you have proof of concept. And that is exactly where Cures Within Reach likes to fund. While we may not be funding to the end of the project, we provide catalytic funding that helps move the process forward. And we found that this is a really successful model. You know, over the years, we've invested over $7 million in repurposing research. And our funded researchers have gone on to raise $67 million in follow-on funding. And we're really pretty proud of that. Cures Within Reach will fund at later stages larger trials where our funding can be complementary and supplemental to existing funding and help create patient impact. We may also fund at the late preclinical stage when that's of interest to our funders as well. And because we're in this proof of concept stage where most of our funding is used, we know that success isn't just a single point in time. Success is a continuum. So when we talk about the successes of our researchers, it's looking at different points in time. We can keep up with our researchers. We follow them for a number of years to see how they're doing and how their research has progressed. So for us, it's not just about, did the research study meet its aims and did we see positive patient outcomes? But in a couple of years, do we have that follow-on funding? 5 or 10 years down the line, how is this repurposed therapy impacting patients broadly? And we track all of that. All of that is important to Cures Within Reach as success. So as I mentioned, we have these funding opportunities that I said are population agnostic. You might be wondering what that means. Well, in 2021, Cures Within Reach launched 3 new initiatives to impact specific patient populations and researcher populations. The first of which was an initiative to fund repurposing research impacting veterans. The second focused on pediatrics, specifically pediatric rare diseases, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Thirdly, we have our research opportunities in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. And these 3 are still accepting proposals. So they might be of interest to the PIs who are joining us here today. Again, these funding opportunities are for repurposing clinical trials, the first in any disease area led by a US-based racial minority that's underserved and underrepresented in biomedical research. The second is for Chicago area researchers who are investigating how repurposing can positively impact health disparities. And the third is for underserved researchers who are located in low and lower middle income countries. If you are interested in learning more about any of these funding opportunities, please visit the website below or contact us directly. I'd be happy to talk to you more about that. And on the previous slide, you might see that proposals are due by a certain date. And that's because we have a 2-step submission process. The first are brief proposals. These proposals are lighter on scientific details, but they give us a general idea of what the PI is interested in investigating. Once we get all the proposals in, we send those out to our external review board, which includes representatives from academia, from clinical medicine, from industry, and from patient groups. We always include the patient or caregiver voice on all of our review submissions. Once those reviews come back, we rank all of the proposals, and the top proposals are then invited to submit a full grant. And it's at this stage that we get more detailed scientific explanation of the project. And the review process starts again. Finally, once we get the full grants back, we make a final funding decision. And I would like to note that we do share feedback with our PIs all along the way. We feel like this is really important in getting the strongest research possible, and we like to make it a collaborative effort. So that's how we fund a large portion of our projects, but there is another mechanism. And luckily, everybody who's attending today has the opportunity to experience this firsthand. This is our Cure Accelerator Live philanthropic pitch event. So imagine Shark Tank or a business plan competition where entrepreneurs pitch their business ideas. It's the same thing, except now we have PIs who are pitching their clinical repurposing research trials. In these events, we typically invite 3 to 5 finalists. If it's an in-person event like we used to have, we have them present. In today's, you'll see pre-recorded pitches when in a virtual world. And then we have live Q&A with an expert panel. And here's the most exciting thing. Everybody who attends has a vote in selecting the next project for funding. So I encourage you to join us at 4:30 p.m. today. We'll be having Cure Accelerator Live. You'll hear from 4 fantastic finalists, all of whom deserve to be funded. So, again, I believe that, Cures Within Reach is a great opportunity, and repurposing research is a great opportunity for young investigators to think about how they can get that catalytic funding, that seed funding they need to send their projects forward and get and be able to attract more funding down the road. If you're interested in learning more about any of these pieces of information, please contact me. My contact information is on the screen here. And I would now like to turn it over to Sheldon Garrison for his presentation.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending. My role is a little bit different. I'm probably, like many of the attendees, trying to get funding. And I'll be honest with you, I've been at the highest highs with $26 million award, the lowest lows with going a year without anything. And so hopefully I can provide something that you find useful. I'm a scientist at Advocate Aurora Health. It's part of specifically within the Advocate Aurora Research Institute. Most people aren't familiar with the healthcare system, but we're actually the 9th largest in the United States. And I have a strong focus on rare disease. I'm indifferent to what type of condition. I typically work with different clinicians who have a problem that they're trying to solve, and we work together to be able to come up with that solution. What I'll be talking about today is some of the lessons learned through this process, and hopefully give some pieces of information. So, the first thing that I know as a grant reviewer, and certainly that I've had to orient myself to, is really communicating why we want to research with rare disease and why do we really want to champion that. It's something that I think a lot of times does well to be in the forefront of these conversations, yet some of us, myself included, haven't always done that. And I think that's something that's pretty important. It's important because you have conditions that really have very specific interested parties, both patients, families, foundations, advocacy groups, and very limited numbers of researchers or commercial companies that are developing something. And so that means you have this great opportunity to have this substantial patient impact. You have an opportunity to really work within a unique patient population. And from a publication standpoint, because publications are, oftentimes drive some of your funding opportunities, you have opportunities to get into higher impact journals as you start to move things forward. One of the things I think we know on an individual basis is the economic impact of rare disease, but it does take these reminders to different funders, especially those funders that don't normally work with rare disease, to remind them how big of an impact that is. It is important as we go through these to think about the different collaborations and the pipeline opportunities, which you'll hear me talk about in a couple slides. This is the idea that as you work with these specific rare diseases, you don't want to be afraid of also thinking about other diseases that have shared biology or different mechanisms that you can also help to co-develop product for. So one of the the challenges that I'm sure many of us on this call face is like answer the questions. Well, why is this important? All right, I work for a massive healthcare system. Why is this important that we pursue these different rare conditions or a specific rare condition? And so one of the things that I've found some success with is really coming into this with a roadmap of what it means to have a patient within a healthcare system, whether it's your own healthcare system or data that you might find with a collaborator or in the public domain. We want to familiarize reviewers with these conditions as we start to apply for funding. Think about it. There's, depending on which paper you open, there's somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 recognized rare diseases. It's impossible for most people to really be familiar with each and every one of them. And so really figuring out ways to clearly communicate what's important with your particular condition of interest and how it's actually going to impact the patients. Pulling together a team, which you'll see in a couple slides, is going to be critical for this. With rare diseases, we can't live in a world where we're siloed. As researchers, it's sometimes easy to work on your one particular protein or your one particular space. With rare disease, it requires so much more. It requires that clinician, it requires that advocacy group, it requires that patient story to really make that case for the points that I've already mentioned. And, you know, again, this is beyond publications, but really publications can influence how likely it is for you to get that funding. Something that is often overlooked, particularly for those in preclinical research or those maybe working in a healthcare system, is the commercialization. So it's important for some funders, not important for others, but having this real pathway where you can say and demonstrate that a success in your project isn't just going to work for a few people that might be in your particular area, but it's something that can be expanded well beyond it. And being able to communicate that is important. And that does give you some opportunities to develop some intellectual property like patents or orphan drug designations that can help support and bolster that statement. The challenge, of course, is how do you balance the publication with confidentiality? And I don't know that there's a right or wrong, but it's something that one should always consider. For those working at academic research institutes, usually have a tech transfer office that can help guide you through that. And I would always recommend reaching out to them early. I can't tell you how many times I've heard from our tech transfer office that they hear about things like 2 or 3 months too late before anything can be done. So that's important. So how do we bring all this together? Kind of through a bunch of different factors that I'm always thinking about as someone that's trying to get funding. And again, we're talking about 1 in 10 people that have a rare disease. How do I get people excited in my organization? And how do I get funders excited by doing that, particularly funders that aren't necessarily working within the rare disease space? And something that is somewhat hot off the press is the financial impact. You know, like it or not, financial impact does, usually grab people's attention. Something that our teams recently found out, and it's in press right now with genetics and medicine, is that nearly half of all healthcare costs are with, how should I say it, with someone with a rare condition. It doesn't mean they're being treated for that condition, but somewhere in their record, they have one of these, some rare disease. That should be eye-opening, that it's that massive an impact, yet we don't really talk about it too much. Again, bringing these elements into your project is I think, really imperative and key. Bringing the right people together. For us, we have a product that we're developing called Infogene at the hospital. And it's really helping people with rare conditions to detect things genetically early on in the disease course. And we have a team that works on that. And that's great, but we can't do it alone. And one piece of advice that I have is to find those clinical advisors, of which we try to find specialists within our healthcare system. We have that advantage. Many of you probably do too, where I can ask these different clinicians, like, what's it like? What's your experience? How's it going? We can leverage our patient records and look at what is the patient experience for some of these conditions. That's immensely powerful. having the leadership advisors. There are people that simply don't work directly in research that can provide tremendous value. I try to find those different leaders within our organization. They'll even write letters of support to help do this. And they've also found money to help support the project once they're on board and they start to see what you're doing, which gets into what Claire had mentioned, which is come back when. All right. Well, sometimes there's even a comeback when before that first comeback when. And so we need to do a little something ahead of time. You'd be surprised once some of the leadership advisors see what you're doing, they hear the patient's story, they see what the impact is, they see the financial side, and they start to get behind that. I've absolutely found that within my own experience. And patient advocacy groups, I say volunteer, volunteer, volunteer. Whenever you can, whether it's your rare condition of interest or something like global genes that serves many different conditions broadly, get involved with these different types of groups because you have an opportunity to work together then to really make something that is efficacious or develop, like in terms of repurposing a drug, develop something that's really going to be efficacious and important to the people that need it. So, need it the most. So where do we get the funding then? I mean, that's a decision that all different researchers are constantly faced with. Okay, who's the most likely to fund your project? That is not an easy answer. There are different foundations which tend to be very focused, and that's great. Actually, I like working with foundations quite a bit. The National Institutes of Health is a major funder for research broadly. Different special programs, and I already mentioned the internal support. The thing you need to think about, though, is what is it that you're doing? So in the case of a repurposed drug, some groups, let's say within the NIH, are less excited or enthusiastic with a repurposed drug unless there's something novel about it or there's a commercial potential for it or something like that. And so, for instance, I'll tell you about a rejection for a grant or an unfunded grant for the NIH that we had. We have a drug that we're repurposing, and we were taking a garden variety normally FDA used excipient to kind of blend together with the drug so that we can give it to the patients and tailor it to the patients of interest. Well, the reviewers weren't enthusiastic about that. And the main note that they had is there's nothing novel about the formulation that you're putting your drug into. There's nothing novel about it. It already exists. You're just combining two known things. Well, maybe that wasn't the right group to go for. Maybe it is that foundation. Maybe it's Cures Within Reach. Maybe it's one of these other programs that really have an eye towards making sure we can bring something to the clinic and get it to the patients. You have to figure out what that is. Others might be developing those new formulations or a totally new drug, and that would be certainly different. Looking at different opportunities, like if there's commercial awards, there's commercial potential, you can develop a LLC, and that opens up an entire new window and avenue for groups. And it's a little scary at times, but there are many different entrepreneurial organizations that have volunteer help for this. They help to prepare people for different pitches, different things like that, which are incredibly helpful. And there's different university programs. For instance, I'm in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and we have Marquette University that has a legal clinic. Well, they help to support those LLCs with all the legal interests that may be involved in a particular project that you have to think about if you're looking at these getting funding on a holistic level. So there's a lot. This was very quick, of course, but my contact email is right here. And to be honest with you, one of the easiest, best ways to reach me is LinkedIn. Please feel free to add me and follow up with some conversations, follow up with collaborative interests. I would love to hear from you. So thank you very much for your time and attention.
Hello, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm Katja Brose, and I wanted to briefly introduce myself before I start this presentation. So I'm currently a program officer at the Zuckerberg Initiative, where I'm on the science team and I lead our efforts around neurodegenerative disease. My background is I have a PhD in cell biology, biochemistry, and neuroscience from UCSF. And prior to my work at CZI was an editor at Cell Press, where I edited the journal Neuron as editor-in-chief. And so from the perspective of this panel, hopefully here I'll share some of my current work around funding for early career researchers, but also happy to take questions around publishing. And at one point I was an early career researcher. So my goal here is just to give you an overview of the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, specifically our science work, which I think some of you may be familiar with, but not all, and really kind of direct you to the work of two specific programs, my work on neurodegenerative disease and our Rare as One program that is funding research networks in the rare disease space. So for those of you who don't know CZI was founded a little over 3 years ago by Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan. Mark Zuckerberg, of course, is the founder and CEO of Facebook. Priscilla is a pediatrician, and the work of CZI really marries their interests around technology, medicine, and advocacy. And we fund and work in 3 areas: science, education, justice advocacy, as well as funding and supporting kind of local community issues here in the Bay Area. The science team has the mission, very grand mission statement of supporting the science and technology that will make it possible to cure, prevent, or manage all diseases by the end of this century. And that's a very big statement, and I always find that it helps to kind of unpack what we mean by that. End of the century, it's getting closer every year. It's 80 years, actually 79 years now. And I think the main kind of vision or inspiration for that vision really comes from thinking about the progress that has been made over the last 80 years. When we think about this past year with COVID, the pandemic, but think our minds back even further and think about the number of infectious diseases, cancers, HIVs, that now have either been cured or are manageable conditions. And the goal of CZI is really to kind of think about if that's the progress that science, technology, patient communities working together could have made over the last 80 years, what can we do now over the next 80 to really kind of accelerate that progress? And so that 80-year mission statement for CZI Science boils down to a mission statement for our next 10 years of really focusing on how we can accelerate biomedical science by developing new tools and technologies and supporting open collaborative models of research. And so one thing to point out, which I think will be clearer as I talk about our program work, is that although we have our sights square on these clinical and translational goals, we're really an organization that in the here and now is focused on basic biomedical research and really thinking about how to, again, develop new tools and technologies and open models for research that will then accelerate the impact that basic science can have for longer term clinical goals. We think a lot on the team about how we can build on synergies between different constituents, so researchers, clinicians, and patients and their families, to accelerate research and drive progress against disease. And the 2 programs that I want to talk to you about today are really just exemplars of that approach. I won't be able to tell you everything that CZI is doing. As a funding organization, we may be a little bit different than other funders that you might be thinking about, whether it's large national funders like here in the US, the NIH, or private disease foundations that might be focused on one or few diseases. We are a funder. We fund. We give out grants through primarily competitive RFAs, so invited competitions for funding. We have, as a focus in our funding efforts, certainly early career investigators, although that's not exclusive. We fund at all stages of careers. And also, I think, given our interest around technology, focus in computational biology. Beyond funding, we are also a technology organization. So CZI Science has a large group of engineers, primarily software engineers, that work with us and are really responsible for kind of looking to develop synergies with the program group and to develop tools and technologies that can support our goals around accelerating research. We also are, I think, what some might call kind of an activist funder. We are definitely not a funder that we give you the money and go away and ask for your grant report at the end. We really collaborate actively with both our grantees, with other funders, and with other partners and communities in the space. And I'll tell you more about that in the context of the programs that I'll mention. And then we see ourselves as really kind of engaging with the larger public. We see patients, patient families, and the public as our partners in this process, and have a number of initiatives that in particular are aimed at public engagement. This is a list of the programs that we fund. And again, I won't have time to talk to you about all of them. I think there are some common themes in approach across these programs. One is we're still a relatively new organization, so less than 5 years old on the science team. And so everything we do really still is an experiment. We think a lot about how we can be innovative as funders, as technologists, and do a lot of pilots. So we do a lot of experiments in how we can kind of accelerate science through new models of funding and partnership. And some of those models work and some don't. So we're often thinking about the next experiment, but it does also mean that we don't, unlike the NIH, have kind of a rolling set of RFAs that you might consistently expect to come up year on year. We're also, as I mentioned several times, very interested in building tools and resources for the research community. And again, we do this hand in hand with external partners as well as with our engineering team. And a lot of what we do is around kind of thinking about how we can change the culture in and around science. So how to make it more open, more collaborative, more diverse, equitable, inclusive. The two programs that I want to tell you about are the work that I lead in neurodegeneration and the work in our Rare as One network. And both have some common features that I'll talk about at the end, in particular with an eye towards how early career researchers might find them interesting. So the neurodegeneration work is centered on a project called the Neurodegeneration Challenge Network. And really the vision of the Challenge Network is to create kind of a new kind of consortium model. So a consortium model that brings together interdisciplinary researchers, clinicians, patients, scientific basic researchers, but also computational biologists, engineers, to work on basic science mechanisms of neurodegenerative disease. And so we again have a disease focus, but from a very basic science perspective. We are explicitly cross-disciplinary and cross-disease. So you think of neurodegenerative disease as being the big diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Huntington's, and ALS, but really there's hundreds of neurodegenerative conditions, just as there are thousands of rare diseases. And we're really thinking about creating a network that's not focused on one or few diseases, but really looks at commonalities, both in terms of the biology and in terms of the approach towards solving of multiple neurodegenerative diseases. We have an explicit early career focus in all of our grant programs. We currently have 3 grant programs that are part of this network, 108 PIs and their teams. And importantly, we really look to bring in students, postdocs, and staff scientists. And so we have across the program about 500 NDCN affiliates is what we call them. So these are students, postdoc staff who benefit from some of our training and engagement activities. I mean, these are the 3 current grantee awards that we're funding in, and we don't have any current open activities or RFAs, but we should have some coming up next year that you might be interested in. The second program that I wanted to mention is led by my colleagues Tanya Simoncelli and Heidi Bjornson-Pennell and their staffs, and this is the Rare as One network that some of you may know about. And this, like NDCN, is also trying to create a community, a collaborative research network, but really is focused on rare disease and specifically patients and patient advocacy organizations. And the first RFA for Rare as One funded 30 grantees, so 30 patient-driven research organizations and advocacy groups for $450,000 over 2 years. And really, it is intended as a grant that would help those individual advocacy organizations build and strengthen their collaborative research networks, to host an international research meeting, and to line their community around shared research priorities. And importantly, to bring those 30 groups together in a community to learn from one another. There's a second RFA that some of you, I'm sure, are aware of that just closed and that's currently in review. And I'm going to close with this slide to just give you very briefly some commonalities across our approach and where I think this could be interesting and important for early career researchers. So both of these programs are really about learning. They're both incubator models. We're really doing a lot of experimentation, and this can be like a really exciting place for early career investigators to get involved. We are looking to change the culture of science, again, to make it more open, collaborative, and to change the incentives. Building communities that break down research silos, and importantly, bring in new people and ideas into these fields. For NDCN, we've explicitly looked to recruit early career researchers from outside the neurodegeneration field. And again, the value of interdisciplinary collaborations. And I think that's, again, a great place for early career researchers to get involved. And again, in the how, I mentioned the funding, but a lot of the work that we do is really about training and capacity building for those grantees and those networks once we fund them. We do a lot around supporting early career researchers with leadership and mentorship training. Again, looking to work with our investigators to build tools, both research tools and infrastructure knowledge tools. Diversity, equity, inclusion is at the center of everything we do, and something that I think we collectively feel we need to and can do better at. And so always looking to recruit new talent and partners there. And again, all of this is done not alone at CZI, but with critical partners in these communities, other funders, other organizations. And so I will stop there and put up this slide, which just gives you my contact information. If you're interested in either of those programs, you could reach out to me and I'll connect you to the right person, and you can find out more on our website or follow us on social media. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much to both of you for helping us today and sharing those great presentations. I know I learned a lot. I heard a lot of really interesting points, and I took a lot of notes. So we'll just go ahead and dive in with the Q&A. I am having a little trouble with my my attendee Q&A, but I'll start off with a couple questions that I had in mind. So I think probably one question that's top of mind to all the PIs out there who are listening to this is, you know, what does it take to attract funding? And Sheldon, I think you gave a really great overview about how you can do some engagement internally at your own institution. I know that Cures Within Reach, when we look at submissions from young investigators, we looked very strongly at the letters of support, not only from their own departments and their mentors, but also outside organizations like patient advocacy groups, like you mentioned, Sheldon. And Katja, you know, you and the CZI group, you really put a focus on those early investigators. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what CZI looks for from these early investigators to really make their applications stand out.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so the first thing I'd say, I think would apply to any funding organization. I think for whether you're an early career researcher or somebody at a different stage of career, I mean, it's important to pay attention to the RFA and what the call is. And so, I mean, not every proposal and every scientific project that you might have in your portfolio would be appropriate for every RFA. And so our RFAs tend to be you know, fairly targeted RFAs. So for instance, my RFAs within the neurodegeneration program, our first one for early career investigators was a 5-year investigator award, and it was really explicitly focused on people who were, you know, relatively new to the field. We didn't require preliminary data. We didn't require having been in the field before, but we required you to have a good idea. And so we're always focused on like, what's the science, the strength of the science, and the quality of the idea. But different RFAs might be tuned differently towards a brand new idea, a brand new team. Most of our RFAs tend to be collaborative, so it may be about finding the right partners. But there certainly are other RFAs that we've done in other programs at CZI that maybe are more targeted to a particular need. Or I imagine other funders, it may be very explicit, like it needs to be translational or a clinical trial versus basic science. And so I think the advice I would give is general, like reading the RFA. We try to give very detailed information in our RFA of what we're looking for, even when the call is broad, and making sure that what you're pitching actually matches kind of what the call is. I think that's good advice for anyone at any stage, but in particular for early careers, I would advise that in particular.
Great, thank you so much. I think that's really wise advice, and I think that reading the RFA is actually something that it needs to be said sometimes. So thank you for sharing that. And along those same lines, you were talking about preliminary data. And Sheldon, as somebody, you said that you've applied for all kinds of different grants of all kinds of different funding amounts. Have you found that funders have a particular preference for certain types of data, whether it's preclinical or clinical, that you found to be more effective or successful when applying for funding?
That's a great question. I think it depends on the funder and what they're looking for. So for instance, I mentioned the NIH, and of course, the NIH has many awards, and there's some that really align these different things, but they really focus on this real advancement in technology. I mean, they want something new oftentimes. And so they're looking for, how are you going to execute on this? What work have you done? Some very detailed preliminary data that will support your position that you're going to move things forward. Whereas some foundations and think about like drug repurposing aren't necessarily wanting someone to spend half of the grant focusing on the mechanism of action and all the very small details, when your goal really is to launch a clinical trial or put yourself in a position to launch a clinical trial. So it really depends on what that organization is. One thing that I've found to be pretty successful is when you reach out to the different organizations, have a contact there that can guide you through some of the things that they're looking for so that you can really tailor your application. I think probably everybody in this meeting has much more data and information than what can actually fit in a 6-page grant or something like that. So what does that funder want to see? And then bring that in. I think it's really key.
Yeah, that's great. And, I love your point about the mechanism of action, because at Cures Within Reach, we always say, patients don't care how it works. They just care that it works. And, unfortunately, my iPad crashed, so I can't see all the attendee questions right now. But one I did see before that happened was about patient groups and how data from patient groups can play a role in applications, in building the project and engaging them all along the way. Sheldon, you brought up a great point about how it's the PIs who reach out to the patient groups, but what are you looking for from the patient groups? What can the patient groups offer you as you're putting together an application?
So one of the challenges that in rare diseases, there tends to be a disconnect between what clinicians find is the most important feature of that condition, what the patients find, and what their caregivers or families find to be most important. And so one of the things that I look for is learning more about what's most important to the patient and caregiver. Ultimately, they're going to be the people that are the recipients of whatever it is that you're developing if you're successful. So how can I make the biggest and most important impact with our patients as opposed to anybody else? And I can give you an example with Prader-Willi syndrome. This is a really tough, rare condition that affects about 30,000 people. And if you talk to many of the clinicians, many clinicians are very focused on obesity, which is a major feature of Prader-Willi, and just the management of that and comorbidities. If you talk to the patients, they're very focused on the insatiable appetite that's associated with the disease. It's a key part of the disease. And that's something that's really important to them. If you talk to the families, it's those two things, but also their body focused impulse control disorders like skin picking and hair pulling ends up being some of the most devastating components of the condition. So you have 3 different groups, all with 3 different needs. And you really have to spend time and learn about that and then tailor your work to addressing that. Even in clinical trials, what's going to be the most important clinical endpoint as you move forward? So,
yeah. And And Katja, I am wondering if, CZI, as they're more in the basic research space, how their involvement with patients and engagement with patients and patient groups, is that similar? Is that different than what Sheldon was describing in a more clinical situation?
Yeah, I mean, the two programs that I mentioned, so my work on the neurodegeneration program is really focused on researchers and research communities, including clinicians, and definitely intersecting with patients. The work of RARES 1 is really more about funding the patient advocacy groups to help them create scientific research programs within their advocacy organizations. And I think what's been really exciting as those two networks have been developing for about the same time, around 2-ish, 3 years now, is we're starting to kind of bring the networks together. And I think this will lead, there isn't a current open RFA for this, but I think this will lead down the road to collaborative funding for researchers and patients. I think that's on the horizon for us. But right now, what we've been doing is bringing some of those groups together, and it's really exciting. So, for instance, we're just about to have in the coming 2 weeks our annual investigator meeting for the neurodegeneration program. We did this; it'll be virtual. We did it virtual last year, and we were able to bring in some of the patient groups from the RARES 1 network into that network. And what's been exciting is to see kind of the synergy of the two networks and how the researchers engage with one another. And we've seen some, really promising relationships kind of build from that intersection of the networks themselves. And so some patient groups who work on, frankly, rare diseases that our basic scientist researchers had never heard of or thought of or felt like they had something to contribute towards, have connected and now are working together. And that's happening actually more frequently now, organically, than I would have expected. And I think our hope is by catalyzing kind of more of that through funding efforts down the road that really try to bring patients together, patients and patients' families together with research in a collaborative funding space, that we can kind of stimulate more of that. I would say one important thing that maybe patient groups should think about, and the researchers themselves should also thinking about, is kind of the nature of that partnership. I mean, not every scientist is going to be a great partner for a patient group. I think you really have to think about kind of what the disease is, kind of where the status of the disease is with respect to kind of trying to progress your goals around treatment. I think basic scientists have a lot to contribute, but they are also going to have, some of them, less skills around maybe clinical trials and translational development. So not every scientist or clinician is kind of cut from the same cloth. And I think it's important to kind of have that partnership be just like any partnership, whether professional or personal, to just be tuned to mutual goals. And I think once that happens, it's magic, right? I think things can move forward. But what I would encourage early career researchers to think about is think about how you could contribute. I think often maybe patient groups, if they're doing a literature search or they're connecting through their networks, they might be trying to hit up some of the more senior famous people in the field, thinking that that's the place to get the best set of skills and talent and expertise. But I think there's just a lot of early career researchers that have much to contribute and maybe have, well, frankly, more time and energy to contribute. And I think maybe then the trick is kind of getting together and synergizing around mutual interests and expertise to kind of then get that funding, which, is challenging. But I would encourage both patient groups and early career researchers to think about how they can serve one another.
I think that's a great place to stop for today. Unfortunately, I think we have way more questions and topics of conversation than we can cover. So I want to say thank you so much to Sheldon and Katja for joining us today. We have all of your questions in the chat, and we will try and follow up where we can. So I appreciate the questions that were sent. Again, just a few other housekeeping details for you. Before you head to the next session, please take a few moments to respond to the polls that are being launched. We really value your feedback, and we want to ensure that we're providing relevant and impactful content throughout the program and beyond for the rare disease community. Up next, you have your choice of 2 different sessions. You can either join the breakout Data Strategy for Research and Development, What do advocates need to know? Or Waste Not, Want Not, making the most of small patient population data. To join the next session, please exit the player after you finish the polls and then return to the agenda page. And speaking of the polls, you can also share your feedback via events@globalgenes.org. Please take some time to explore the event page, visit the posters, build your itinerary for the remainder of the week, plus visit the Achievements and Badges tab to learn more about how you can win a free pass to a future Global Genes program. Ooh, that's exciting. All right, well, thank you again, everyone. It was a great session, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference.